The young nurse's name was Clara Bennett, and in the spring of 1992, she was 23 years old, standing on the precipice of a life she had fought tooth and nail to build. She was not a woman who faded into the background. She was described, by everyone who knew her, as a quiet force. A person who listened more than she spoke, but when she did speak, her words carried a weight that made people stop and pay attention. She was the eldest daughter of a steelworker and a seamstress, raised in a modest two-bedroom home on the south side of Millbrook, a small city that was more of a large town, nestled in a valley that was perpetually shrouded in a damp, clinging mist. Millbrook was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, or at least they thought they did. But as the decades would prove, the town's most devastating secret had been hiding in plain sight for a very, very long time. Clara had always wanted to be a nurse. It wasn't a fleeting childhood fancy. It was a vocation born from the time her younger brother, Samuel, was stricken with a severe case of pneumonia at the age of 6. The family, with little money and a lot of anxiety, had spent weeks in the sterile, intimidating halls of Millbrook General Hospital. The nurses, with their crisp white uniforms and calm, capable hands, had been the only source of light in that terrifying time. They were the ones who held Clara's hand while her mother wept, who explained the impossible medical jargon in words a terrified young girl could understand, and who, most importantly, brought her brother back to them. Clara had looked into the eyes of those women and saw not just a job, but a calling. She was going to be that kind of light for someone else. Her path to that goal was not easy. Money was perpetually tight. Clara worked double shifts at a local diner through her late teens, saving every single tip for nursing school. She was accepted into the program at the State University, a 2-hour bus ride from Millbrook, but she refused to live on campus. She couldn't afford the dorm fees, and she needed to keep her job at the diner to support her family. So, every day, for 4 years, she would wake before dawn, take the rattling Greyhound into the city, attend her classes, study in the library, and then make the long journey back home in the dead of night. She graduated top of her class, her thesis on the psychological care of long-term patients earning her a commendation from the dean. It was a remarkable achievement, a testament to her tenacity and her singular focus. Upon graduation, she had her pick of jobs. A prestigious hospital in the state capital had even offered her a position in their pediatric wing. It was her dream job, but Clara turned it down. Her family needed her. Her father's back had finally given out after 30 years in the mill, and her mother's eyesight was failing, the delicate work of a seamstress becoming a painful strain. So Clara chose to stay in Millbrook. She took a position at the very hospital that had saved her brother's life, Millbrook General. It was a smaller, older facility, one of those hospitals that felt like it was built in the 1940s, with linoleum floors that had been waxed 1,000,000 times over and smelled of antiseptic and stale coffee. It wasn't glamorous, but it was hers. It was a place where she could make a tangible difference, to be the light for someone else's family. By 1992, Clara had been working at Millbrook General for about 18 months. She had quickly risen through the ranks, her meticulous nature and compassionate bedside manner earning her the respect of both her patients and the senior staff. She was assigned to the third-floor medical surgical unit, the busiest and most demanding floor in the entire hospital. It was the kind of place where chaos was the only constant, where the sound of beeping monitors, ringing phones, and shuffling gurneys was the unofficial soundtrack. But Clara thrived in the controlled pandemonium. Her colleagues described her as unflappable. Under pressure, she became even more focused, more precise. One of those colleagues was a fellow nurse named Rebecca Hayes. Becca was the polar opposite of Clara. Where Clara was reserved and bookish, Becca was a force of nature, loud, brash, full of stories, and a dedicated gossip. She was the type of person who could find out the dirt on anyone in the hospital within an hour. Becca and Clara had become fast friends, an unlikely pairing that worked because Becca acted as Clara's translator to the outside world, while Clara provided a quiet, grounding presence for Becca's manic energy. They would often share their breaks in the small, windowless staff lounge, trading stories about their day, venting about overbearing doctors, and sharing their dreams. Clara's dream, beyond her career, was simple. She wanted a family of her own. She was quietly dating a man named Daniel Webb, a mechanic who worked at a garage on the outskirts of town. Daniel was a good man, solid, reliable, and clearly smitten with Clara. He was a gentle giant of a man, with calloused hands and a shy smile that could light up a room. He was everything you'd expect a small-town mechanic to be: unassuming, dependable, and deeply in love with his girlfriend. He had proposed to her just 2 weeks before she vanished, a small diamond solitaire on a simple gold band that Clara wore with immense pride. They had set a date for the following summer. The wedding was going to be small, at the town's old stone church where her parents had been married. The reception would be in the local VFW hall. It was a modest dream, but it was their dream, and Clara had never been happier. She had finally achieved everything she had set her mind to. The night of April 14, 1992, started like any other night shift at Millbrook General. Clara arrived at 6:45 p.m., 15 minutes early, as was her custom. She was wearing her uniform, a now outmoded but still required starched white dress. Her chestnut hair, which she usually wore in a practical ponytail, was tied back tightly. She pinned her silver name badge on her chest, the one that read, C. Bennett, RN, and took her report from the outgoing day shift. The third floor was understaffed that night. 2 nurses had called in sick, and the hospital, as usual, was refusing to pay for agency staff to fill the gaps. This meant Clara and Becca, who was also on duty, were looking at a long, brutal shift with a full patient load. There was no time for small talk. It was all hands on deck from the moment the shift began. The night was a blur of controlled emergencies. A patient in room 312, an elderly man with congestive heart failure, had a rapid decline, his oxygen saturation plummeting. Clara was at his bedside in seconds, her movements calm and efficient as she titrated his oxygen, administered the prescribed diuretic, and calmly informed the on-call physician. She stabilized him, spoke gently to his terrified wife who had been dozing in a chair next to his bed, and then was immediately called to the nurse's station because a post-surgical patient in 318 was complaining of severe abdominal pain. She spent an hour soothing him, adjusting his morphine pump, and checking his vitals every 15 minutes. It was a night of running, of focused energy, of lives holding in the balance. Becca and Clara managed to grab a few minutes of respite at 1:30 a.m. The floor was eerily quiet, that strange lull that happens in the middle of the night. They were sitting at the nurse's station, which was a large, horseshoe-shaped desk cluttered with patient charts, coffee cups, and empty candy wrappers. The only light in the corridor was the soft glow of the fluorescent fixtures above and the dimmer night lights outside each patient room. The air smelled faintly of the grilled cheese sandwiches they'd just eaten for their dinner. Becca leaned over the counter, her voice a low murmur. "So, you and Daniel, you're seriously going to do the whole happily ever after thing? Get a house with a white picket fence and a little dog?" Clara smiled, the first genuine smile of the night. It was tired, but it reached her eyes. "Maybe not a white picket fence, but a little garden in the back, I think. And yeah, a dog. A golden retriever. He's allergic to cats." Becca shook her head, grinning. "Just promise me you won't turn into one of those boring married people. You'll still come out for a drink with me? We can get you into trouble." Clara laughed softly. "Becca, you're trouble enough for the both of us. Besides, you're the matron of honor. You'll be in charge of the bachelorette party. I'm a little scared of what you have planned." "Good, you should be," Becca winked. "But seriously, Clara, you deserve this. You've worked so hard for everything. You're the only person I know who actually earned her happiness." She paused, a more serious look crossing her face. "Just don't forget the little people when you're a rich doctor's wife." Clara laughed again, a genuine, warm sound. "Daniel fixes cars for a living. The richest thing about him is his heart." She looked at her watch. 2:45 a.m. "I need to do my rounds. Mrs. Kowalski in 314 is supposed to have her pain meds." "Oh, don't worry about her," Becca said, waving a dismissive hand. "I took care of it when I was on my last check. You just sit for another minute. You look exhausted." But Clara shook her head, pulling herself up. No, I need to stay busy. I'll just do a quick check on everyone on the West Wing, then I'm going to start on the 6 a.m. meds. It's going to be a long morning." At 3:15 a.m., the shift change paperwork had started to be prepared. The night was winding down, that final stretch when the fatigue starts to become a physical weight. The nurses who had been running on adrenaline for 8 hours were starting to feel the crash. Clara was in the medication room, a small, windowless space filled with shelves of pharmaceuticals, double-checking a dose of insulin for a diabetic patient. She was meticulous. She checked the name, the dosage, the time, and the patient's ID number 3 times. It was her golden rule. One of the patient care aides, a young man named Eddie, walked past the medication room. He later told police that he saw Clara through the small glass panel in the door. She was humming a soft, almost inaudible tune. The hymn, Amazing Grace. It was something she often did when she was concentrating. He waved at her through the glass, and she smiled and gave him a small wave back. It was 3:30 a.m. At 5 a.m., a critical alarm went off in room 311, a cardiac patient who had been in the hospital for a week. It was a chaotic moment. Becca, who was closer, ran to the room. The patient was having a ventricular fibrillation. It was a full-blown code. Becca yelled for the crash cart, for the doctor on call. The entire nursing staff on the floor, including Clara, would normally have converged on the room. The room filled with a swarm of staff, nurses, respiratory therapists, the on-call physician. They were all focused on the patient, their training taking over. It was a life-and-death situation, a frantic, organized dance of CPR, defibrillation, and drug pushes. The code lasted for over 20 minutes. In the end, they managed to resuscitate the patient. The crisis was averted. It was only after the patient was stabilized and the doctor had given his orders that the staff finally started to take stock. Becca was wiping sweat from her brow, her hands shaking slightly from the adrenaline. She looked around the room, her mind still processing the chaos. Okay, who's got the vitals? Someone paged the attending. She looked for Clara. She knew Clara would have been in the thick of it. They usually worked in tandem during a code. But she wasn't there. Becca walked out into the hallway, thinking maybe she had gone to get more supplies. The hallway was quiet, the fluorescent lights humming their steady tune. She saw Eddie, the patient care aide, standing at the nurse's station. "Eddie, have you seen Clara?" she asked, a slight note of confusion in her voice. Eddie looked up from his chart. "No, not since before the code. She was in the med room. I thought she'd be right behind me." Becca checked the medication room. It was empty. The drawers were shut. The insulin vial was on the counter, a note next to it in Clara's neat handwriting. For 316, everything seemed in order. Becca walked to the west wing, a short corridor lined with patient rooms. It was quiet. She checked room 314, 315, 316. Nothing. Everything was as it should be. She went to the small staff bathroom down the hall. The door was open, empty. By 6 a.m., a genuine knot of concern had formed in Becca's stomach. It was highly unlike Clara to disappear without saying anything. She was too professional. She was too reliable. The night shift manager, a stern and authoritarian woman named Agnes, was now on the floor. Becca approached her. "Agnes, have you seen Clara?" Becca asked, trying to keep the worry out of her voice. Agnes looked up from a stack of charts, her expression flat. "No. Is she on a break? We have a full patient load, Becca. I can't have the staff disappearing." "She's not on a break," Becca insisted. "I've checked everywhere. She was here for the code, and now she's just gone. Her belongings are still in her locker. Her purse is still in the staff lounge. She wouldn't just leave." Agnes sighed, a sound of pure exasperation. "She's a big girl, Becca. She probably just went to the cafeteria for a coffee or something. She'll be back." But Becca knew better. Clara would never leave the floor unattended in the middle of a shift. She was a professional. She had a deep sense of duty. Becca's alarm bells were ringing loud and clear. She went back to the nurse's station and logged into the hospital's old, clunky computer system. She pulled up the security log. The hospital had a basic system, a log that recorded every time a staff ID badge was used to access certain doors. She scrolled to the time of the code. At 5:04 a.m., during the height of the confusion, Clara Bennett's ID badge had been used to access the hospital's back stairwell. The stairwell was used by staff to move between floors quickly. It led down to the ground floor, which had an exit door to a small parking lot adjacent to the emergency room. A door that did not have a security camera. Becca stared at the screen, a cold dread washing over her. She looked over at Agnes. "Agnes, I think something is wrong. I think she's gone." The initial investigation into Clara Bennett's disappearance was a textbook example of a small-town police department being utterly overwhelmed. Millbrook didn't have its own police force. It was a small municipality that relied on the county sheriff's department, which was headquartered in the county seat, a town about 20 miles away. When Becca, in a panic, called the sheriff's office at 6:45 a.m., her call was taken by a dispatcher who sounded half asleep. It wasn't treated as an emergency. It was a missing person report, but because Clara was an adult, there were strict protocols. They were told that there had to be a 24-hour waiting period before they could file an official report, unless there was evidence of a crime. At that point, there wasn't any. It wasn't until Daniel Webb arrived at the hospital to pick Clara up from her shift, as he did every morning, that the situation became critical. He walked into the lobby, a bouquet of flowers in his hand, daisies, her favorite. He found Becca, who was a wreck, her eyes red-rimmed and her mascara smudged. "Becca, what's wrong?" Daniel asked, his face immediately paling. "Where is Clara? Is she okay?" Becca broke down, trying to explain what had happened. Daniel's gentle demeanor instantly evaporated. A steely resolve replaced it. He was a man of action. He didn't panic, he didn't rage. He just got very, very quiet and very, very focused. He told Becca to call the sheriff's office again, and this time, he insisted on speaking to them himself. He demanded that a deputy be sent out immediately. Deputy Frank Riley was the one who drew the short straw. He was a veteran of the department, a man who had been on the force for over 20 years. He'd seen a lot in that time, but mostly it was drunk and disorderlies, car accidents, and the occasional domestic dispute. He wasn't a detective, he was a patrol officer who was there to handle a routine situation. He arrived at the hospital around 9 a.m., looking tired and slightly disinterested. He listened to Daniel and Becca's frantic story. He made some notes. He looked at the security log. He walked around the ground floor, peering at the exit door to the parking lot. He even took a stroll outside, looking at the gray, overcast sky. He concluded that the most likely scenario was that Clara had simply left. She was a young woman on the verge of a major life change. Weddings are stressful. Maybe she had cold feet. Maybe she just needed some time to herself. He was very polite and condescendingly reassuring, telling Daniel not to worry. "She'll show up, son. They always do." Daniel was apoplectic. "She's not a runaway. She's not a bride with cold feet. She's the most grounded person I've ever met. She wouldn't leave her patients. She wouldn't leave without saying goodbye to me." But Deputy Riley was unmoved. He filed his report. It was a simple, missing person, adult, classification. At 10 a.m., he drove back to the county seat, his job done. The case was officially open, but it was not a priority. For the next 24 hours, Daniel, Becca, and Clara's family, her parents, Harold and Mary, and her brother Samuel, did their own investigation. They called everyone they could think of. They drove around Millbrook, posting hand-drawn flyers on telephone poles. They called the hospital to see if she'd shown up. Nothing. On the second day, Daniel went to the local media. A sympathetic reporter from the Millbrook Gazette ran a small story on the front page. "Local nurse missing after night shift." The story painted a picture of a dedicated, hard-working young woman who had vanished into thin air. It included a photo of Clara, her high school graduation picture, smiling, her eyes full of hope. The story was picked up by a local TV station in the state capital, which ran a quick 30-second segment on their evening news. A missing persons case was finally getting some attention. The state police were called in at the request of the sheriff's department, who were quickly realizing they were out of their depth. The media attention was now creating pressure. A state trooper, a man by the name of Sergeant Michael Mick Corrigan, a veteran investigator with the Major Crimes Unit, was assigned to lead the case. Corrigan was a completely different animal than Deputy Riley. He was a career man, a veteran of the force with a salt-and-pepper mustache and a gruff demeanor that masked a sharp, analytical mind. He'd worked dozens of missing person cases, and in his experience, they all followed certain patterns. Most were runaways, family disputes, or victims of foul play. The first 48 hours were crucial. The timeline had already been seriously compromised by the sheriff's department's delayed response. Corrigan arrived at Millbrook General on April 16, 2 days after Clara had vanished. He brought a full team. He immediately locked down the hospital's security footage, though, as was known, there was very little of it. There were no cameras in the back stairwell, nor the parking lot exit. He interviewed the hospital staff, systematically going through everyone who had been working that night. He was struck by the sheer uniformity of the testimony. Everyone loved Clara. She was a model employee, a friend, a gentle and kind soul. Nobody had a bad word to say about her. Nobody had a motive. It was a maddeningly clean slate. Corrigan then focused on the timeline. The last sighting was by Eddie, the patient care aide, at 3:30 a.m. Then, at 5:04 a.m., the ID badge swiped for the stairwell. A gap of 94 minutes. What happened in that hour and a half? He had the hospital swept for any sign of a struggle. Nothing. No signs of forced entry. No strange marks on the floor. The entire hospital seemed to be a crime scene that had been scrubbed clean. He interviewed Daniel Webb for hours, going over their relationship, her state of mind, their future plans. Daniel was distressed, but also cooperative. He was a man with a simple, clear life, and he was utterly baffled. There was nothing in his past or his demeanor to suggest he would have hurt the woman he loved. His alibi was solid. He was home asleep, he told Corrigan. A neighbor confirmed they saw his truck in the driveway at 3 a.m. He had no motive. He was the grieving fiancé, and he played the part perfectly. The initial investigative trail went cold almost immediately. Corrigan had to expand his search. He looked at Clara's life, trying to find any cracks in the perfect facade. She had no known enemies. She wasn't in debt. She didn't have a secret life. There was no hidden lover. Her past was an open book. But there was one piece of information that piqued Corrigan's interest. Becca Hayes, in her initial interview, had mentioned something that at first seemed like an insignificant detail. Clara was a little bit worried about something, Becca told him. A few weeks before she disappeared. It wasn't like a terrified worry. She just seemed a little distracted. She told me she felt like someone was watching her sometimes. She thought she was being followed. It was just a weird feeling, she said. She even joked about it. Said she was probably just being paranoid from watching too many detective shows. Corrigan sat up straighter in his chair. Did she say who she thought was following her? Becca shook her head. No, she didn't see anyone. It was just a feeling. She told Daniel about it too, I think. He probably thought she was just stressed. I did. Corrigan made a note. A feeling of being followed. In a small, quiet town. It was a thread, a thin one, but a thread nonetheless. He spoke to Daniel about it. Daniel confirmed it. Yeah, she mentioned it a couple of times. I told her it was probably nothing. This town's so small, everybody knows everybody. If someone was following her, she would have recognized them. She said it only happened when she was leaving the hospital. At night, I told her to call me, and I'd come get her. But she said she didn't want to bother me. She was always like that. Never wanted to be a bother. That was the problem. Clara was so self-sufficient, so determined not to be a burden, that it likely prevented her from taking the threat seriously. The investigation had nowhere to go. Corrigan had no physical evidence, no forensic evidence, no witness. He conducted a massive ground search of the area around the hospital. Teams of volunteers scoured the woods, the fields, and the riverbanks. They found nothing. Clara Bennett had simply vanished. The weeks turned into months. The story faded from the news. The state police, stretched thin, had to reallocate their resources. The case became a cold case, a dusty file in a filing cabinet that was occasionally brought out and reviewed by a new generation of officers who would shake their heads and move on. Daniel Webb became a shell of his former self. He continued to live in Millbrook, his grief a palpable weight in the small town. He never moved away, he never remarried. He became a ghost, a perpetual reminder of the town's greatest tragedy. He wore the same gray jacket for years. He kept the daisies he'd bought for her in a vase, letting them wither and die, but never throwing them away. He was stuck in 1992. Becca Hayes left Millbrook. The hospital was too full of memories for her. She moved to a big city on the coast, got a job at a large medical center, and tried to build a new life for herself. But the guilt of that night haunted her. She couldn't shake the feeling that she should have done something more. She should have gone to look for Clara earlier. She should have been more aggressive with the security guard. She relived that night over and over again, the beeping of the monitors, the panic of the code, the unnerving silence of the hallway when she went looking for her friend. The guilt was a shroud she could never quite shrug off. She wrote letters to Clara's parents every year on the anniversary of her disappearance. They were letters of apology, filled with memories of her friend. It was her small way of keeping Clara's spirit alive. The Bennett family was shattered. Mary Bennett never fully recovered. She clung to the hope that her daughter was still alive, that she'd run away and was living a new life somewhere. She would call the police station every few months, asking if there was any news. Each time, she was given the same polite, impersonal answer. "We're still investigating, Mrs. Bennett." Harold Bennett, a stoic and quiet man, internalized his grief. He became withdrawn, spending long hours in his workshop, building small wooden toys and furniture, his hands forever busy, his mind never truly at rest. The family held onto their daughter's memory with a fierce, tenacious grip. They kept her room exactly as it was, a shrine to a life that had been stolen. But the most heartbreaking story was that of Samuel, Clara's younger brother. He had been just 15 when his sister vanished. He had idolized her. She had been his protector, his confidant, the person who had nursed him back to health when he was a sick child. Her disappearance shattered his world. He dropped out of school. He fell into a deep depression. He started using drugs as a way to escape the pain. He spent years in and out of rehab, a lost soul who could never quite find his footing. His life became a testament to the collateral damage of a single unsolved crime. He never forgave himself for not being there to protect her. He blamed himself for not answering the phone that night, for not sensing that something was wrong. The guilt consumed him. The town of Millbrook, too, carried the weight of the mystery. It became a place of whispered suspicions. Neighbors eyed each other with suspicion. People avoided the hospital's back stairwell. The story of the nurse who vanished into thin air became a local legend, a cautionary tale told to children to keep them from wandering off at night. It was a ghost story that was all too real. For 24 years, the case of Clara Bennett was a ghost that haunted the town of Millbrook. It was a source of constant, low-level dread, a cautionary tale whispered to children and newcomers. People would point to the hospital, that's where that nurse disappeared from. Just vanished into thin air. The story became local legend, a campfire tale of mystery and heartbreak. And then, in 2016, the file changed everything. It was a sweltering day in August when a nurse named Lillian Rosenthal was tasked with clearing out the old medical records archive in the basement of Millbrook General. The hospital was finally undergoing a long overdue renovation. They were digitizing their records, a massive project that required a team of clerks and nurses to sift through decades of paper files. Lillian was a young nurse who had only been working at the hospital for a few years. She didn't know the full history of the place, the legends, or the ghosts. She was just doing her job. The archive was a labyrinth of metal shelves that stretched from floor to ceiling, crammed with boxes of medical records, patient files, and administrative documents. The air was thick with dust and the smell of old paper. It was like a forgotten library where every book was a story of sickness and health. Lillian was tasked with a particularly dark and dusty corner, a section of shelves that hadn't been touched in decades. The boxes were unlabeled, their cardboard faded to a dull brown. She reached for a box at the very back of a high shelf, her fingers brushing against years of accumulated grime. It was a heavy box, and as she pulled it down, a thick cloud of dust billowed into the air, making her cough. She set it on the floor and cracked it open. Inside, it wasn't patient files. It was a collection of administrative reports. Personnel files, staff schedules, internal memos, and payroll records from the early 1990s. It was the kind of dull, bureaucratic ephemera that had been deemed not important enough to preserve. Lillian was about to put it in the to be shredded pile when a name caught her eye. It was on a personnel file, the manila folder sticking out slightly from the rest. The file was labeled Andrew J. Walsh. The name itself meant nothing to her, but she noticed the date on the file folder. It was 1992. Her curiosity was piqued. She pulled the folder out. It was thin. Inside were a few sheets of paper, an application for employment, a resume, and a reference letter. And there was something else. A small, handwritten note, almost like a memo to a supervisor, paper clipped to the back of the file. The writing was neat, the kind of formal cursive that was common in the era. Lillian started to read. The note was about Andrew J. Walsh. It detailed a complaint that had been filed against him. The complaint was that he had been seen lingering outside the women's locker room. multiple times. Several female staff members had reported feeling uncomfortable. He was staring at the nurses as they came and went. The note was dated April 15, 1992, the day after Clara Bennett vanished. It stated that Mr. Walsh had been terminated from his position at the hospital immediately, pending an investigation. He had been fired, but there was no final report. There was no record of any investigation. The file just ended. It was a loose end, buried in a dusty archive for 24 years. Lillian's heart started to beat a little faster. She knew about the Clara Bennett case. Everyone who worked at Millbrook General knew about it. It was the story that wouldn't die. And now, here she was, holding a piece of the puzzle that had been hidden in plain sight for almost a quarter of a century. Andrew J. Walsh, a man who was fired for inappropriate behavior the very next day after Clara disappeared. A man the police had never interviewed. A man who was a ghost in the system. She quickly began searching through the rest of the box. She found a few more references to Walsh. There was a copy of a check stub. His payroll records. He was in his late 30s. He'd been hired as a maintenance worker. He'd only worked at the hospital for a few months. He was a drifter. His address on the application was listed as a P.O. box in Millbrook. A dead end. His file was a wasteland of administrative details that told her nothing about the man. But the silence was telling. Why had his complaint been buried? Why was there no police report about him? Why had no one ever mentioned him? Lillian took the file. She didn't put it in the shred pile. She called her supervisor, a woman named Susan who had been a nurse at Millbrook General for over 30 years. Lillian showed her the note about Andrew Walsh. Susan's face went pale. "Oh my God," she whispered. "Andy Walsh. I remember him. I was a young nurse here back then. He was creepy. We all thought he was creepy. He'd hang around the nurses' station for no reason. He'd make weird comments. We told management about him, but nobody did anything. And then after Clara, we just assumed he was fired because of budget cuts or something. We never knew it was because of us. Because of our complaints. And the police never interviewed him?" Lillian asked, shocked. Susan shook her head. "I don't think so. It all happened so fast. The investigation was a mess. The county sheriff's office fumbled it from the start. By the time the state police got involved, he was already gone. He just vanished." Like her, Lillian knew she had found something important, something that had been overlooked for 24 years. She immediately took the file to the hospital administrator, who in turn contacted the current Millbrook County Sheriff, a woman named Sheriff Elena Vargas. Vargas had grown up in the county. She'd heard the stories about Clara Bennett her entire life. She had a personal interest in the case. When she saw the file, she knew it was a significant lead. Sheriff Vargas called in the state police. The case was officially reopened. The initial evidence was now this personnel file. The focus was now on Andrew Walsh. Who was he? Where did he come from? And where was he now? The investigation was no longer a cold case. It was a hunt. The state police assigned a new lead investigator, a detective named Isabella Izzy Torres. Torres was a modern cop, tech-savvy, and possessed a dogged determination. She had a reputation for solving cold cases, for bringing closure to families who had waited decades for answers. She was 29, about the same age Clara had been when she vanished, and she felt a personal connection to the case. She knew what it was like to be a young woman working the night shift, to feel a shadow of fear in a quiet parking lot. Detective Torres dove into the file on Andrew Walsh. The trail was cold, but the internet was a powerful tool. She started with the basic information. Andrew J. Walsh, born circa 1955. The personnel file had his social security number. She ran it through the national databases. The system came back with a hit. Andrew J. Walsh had a criminal record. It was a minor one, but it was there. In the late 1970s, he had been arrested in a neighboring state for peeping Tom charges. He was caught peering into the window of a women's dormitory at a college. He received a suspended sentence and a fine. It was a red flag. A pattern of inappropriate behavior, of violating women's privacy. Torres dug deeper. She found that Walsh had moved around a lot, using a series of different addresses. He worked odd jobs, mostly as a janitor or a handyman. He was a loner. There was no record of him being married, no children. He was a ghost in the system. A classic predator on the fringes. The question was, What happened to him after 1992? Torres ran his name through a more sophisticated database. It gave her a death record. Andrew J. Walsh had died in 1995, just 3 years after Clara's disappearance. The cause of death was listed as a heart attack. He was 40 years old. He had died in a small town 3 states away. He had been working as a night watchman at a textile mill. He had died alone in a rented room. He had never been questioned about Clara Bennett. Torres felt a wave of anger. The man who was the prime suspect in the disappearance of a young woman had been living a quiet life for 3 more years, completely free of suspicion. And then he had taken his secrets to the grave. But she refused to give up. If he was dead, he couldn't provide answers, but maybe he had left something behind. A trail of breadcrumbs, a record of his movements. She obtained the warrant to search his old records. The town where he died was small and cooperative. The local police there had kept a box of his personal effects that had been left in his room when he died. They were gathering dust in a storage room. When Torres opened the box, she felt like she was opening a time capsule. It was a collection of mundane items. A stack of old magazines. Some worn-out clothes. A collection of keys. A few handwritten letters from his mother, who had died years before him. And then she found it. At the bottom of the box, beneath a worn-out denim jacket, was a spiral notebook. It was the kind of cheap, dime store notebook you could buy anywhere. The cover was blank, but when Torres opened it, she saw it was a journal. The handwriting was meticulous, almost too neat. It was the kind of handwriting you'd expect from someone who took great care in everything they did, a chilling counterpoint to the dark contents within. The journal was a record of Andrew Walsh's life. It was a diary of his obsessions. He wrote about women he saw. He described his jobs. He detailed his fantasies. And then, in 1992, the entries changed. They became filled with rage and obsession. He wrote about working at Millbrook General. He wrote about the nurses. He wrote about the beautiful one, a name he never used. But his descriptions left no doubt. He was talking about Clara. He wrote, "I just want to talk to her. I want to tell her how I feel. She looks at me like I'm nothing, like I'm less than the dirt on her shoes. I know she sees me. I know she knows I exist. Why won't she just speak to me? Why does she ignore me? I'm a good man. I have feelings. I have a heart." The entries became more disturbing as the days progressed. He wrote about following her home. He mentioned the back stairwell. He wrote about the code. "She ran from me," he wrote. "She tried to hide. She ran down the stairs. I had to stop her. She made me do it. She made me hurt her." Torres felt the blood run cold in her veins. She had the confession. It was written in his own hand. He had been the one. He had followed her down the stairwell. He had killed her, but he didn't say how. He didn't say where he had taken her. The journal stopped abruptly in April of 1992. The final entry was short, almost apologetic. "It is done. She is at peace now. In a place where she can't look at me with such contempt." Detective Torres had the why and the who, but she didn't have the where. Where was Clara Bennett? For 24 years, her family had been looking for a body. They had never had a grave to visit. They had never had closure. Torres was determined to find her. She studied Walsh's travel records. He left Millbrook very soon after Clara's disappearance. He went to a series of towns, always staying one step ahead of the past. But he was a creature of habit. In his earlier journals, he talked about a place he loved to go. A place he felt at peace. It was a state park, a sprawling, heavily wooded area about 100 miles north of Millbrook. He wrote about camping there. He wrote about the isolation. It was the perfect place to hide something. Torres organized a massive search of the park. A team of forensic anthropologists, cadaver dogs, and volunteers combed a specific area near the park's remote campsites. The search took 3 days. On the 3rd day, a cadaver dog named Max started to act up. He was at the base of a rocky outcropping, a cliff face that overlooked a shallow creek. The dog was barking frantically, his nose buried in the earth. The team started to dig. A few feet down, they found them. Human remains. The skeleton was almost complete. A small gold band on the ring finger of the left hand. They were the remains of Clara Bennett. She had been there for 24 years. There was no sign of a marker, no sign of a grave. She had just been dumped, carelessly, by the man who had taken her life. The forensic analysis confirmed the cause of death. Blunt force trauma to the head. He had struck her with something. A blunt object, probably a heavy tool. It was a brutal, impulsive act. A crime of rage. The discovery of her body was a moment of profound catharsis and deep sorrow for the town of Millbrook. The mystery of her disappearance was solved. The monster who had taken her was identified and, in a grim twist of fate, had already faced his own judgment. Clara's family could finally have a funeral. They could finally bury their daughter. They could finally begin to heal. Daniel Webb, who had spent 24 years waiting, was finally able to let go. He visited her grave every day for a month. He brought her daisies. He told her he was sorry he couldn't save her. And then, for the first time in 24 years, he took off her engagement ring. He placed it on her headstone as a final gesture of his undying love. Becca Hayes flew back to Millbrook for the funeral. She stood with the Bennett family, her face etched with lines of grief that were only partially from age. She had finally gotten closure. She could forgive herself. The town erected a small memorial to Clara Bennett at Millbrook General. A bronze plaque with her name and a quote she had written in her nursing school yearbook. The best way to find yourself is to lose yourself in the service of others. The hospital where she had worked, where she had been a light, became a place of remembrance. But the story of Clara Bennett left an indelible mark on Millbrook. It was a reminder that monsters can live in the most ordinary of places. That evil can be a quiet man with a creepy smile, a man who is easily overlooked, a man who is just doing his job. It was a story of a systemic failure, a case where the system was designed to protect institutions, not victims. It was a story that exposed a truth that many had suspected but no one had been able to prove for 24 years. And it all started with a dusty file in a forgotten basement. A file that had been waiting, for 24 years, to change everything. A file that, in the end, led to the truth. The case of Clara Bennett is now closed. But her memory lives on. She is remembered not as a victim, but as a symbol of resilience, of hope, and of the enduring power of love. Her story serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers that lurk in the shadows, and the importance of speaking up, of trusting your instincts, and of never giving up on the search for truth. Millbrook will never forget Clara Bennett, and neither will the world.